You pay taxes every year, right? But have you ever stopped to wonder where all that money really goes? It's not just funding roads and schools. In fact, a huge portion of your tax dollars ends up in places you'd never expect. Did you know that in 2020, major corporations like Amazon paid zero federal income taxes, despite making billions in profit? Or that the US military receives more than $800 billion of your tax dollars, while social programs like healthcare struggle for funding? Here's the kicker: politicians don't talk about these things. They don't want you to know how they play the tax game, using loopholes, tax cuts, and backdoor deals to keep more money for themselves and their wealthy donors. But we're about to pull back the curtain. In this video, we'll expose the secret tax tricks that the rich and powerful use. You'll learn how your taxes are spent in ways you might not like, and why the system seems to favor the wealthy. Keep watching, because the truth is shocking, and it's time you knew what they don't want you to hear. Chapter 1: The secret tax loopholes only the elite know. Politicians are masters of navigating the tax code. But they don't just follow it, they exploit it. One of the most well-known loopholes is the carried interest loophole. This lets hedge fund managers pay lower tax rates on their earnings, despite making millions. While most people pay taxes based on their income, some of the wealthiest pay far less, thanks to this sneaky trick. According to a report from the Congressional Research Service, this loophole could cost the US government over $15 billion a year. Ever heard of offshore tax havens? They're not just for criminals. Some of the world's most powerful politicians use them to stash their wealth in countries like the Cayman Islands, where tax rates are practically non-existent. In 2020, the US Senate revealed that about $2.7 trillion was hidden in offshore accounts, often by corporations with political connections. But it's not just about hiding money. It's also about how politicians use legal deductions to minimize their taxable income. Think about real estate. Many wealthy individuals, including politicians, use tax depreciation to write off the value of their properties over time, reducing the amount they owe. Even the ultra-wealthy don't pay much in taxes on their wealth, thanks to the step up in basis rule. This rule allows them to pass on assets like stocks and real estate to heirs without paying the capital gains taxes they'd face if they sold them. When you add these strategies up, it's clear that taxes are not designed equally. The rules are stacked in favor of the elite. Chapter 2: How your tax dollars fund what they don't want you to see. When politicians talk about taxes, they often focus on the programs that benefit everyday people, like healthcare or education. But what they often leave out is how tax revenue also funds big corporations and massive defense budgets. In 2022, US military spending exceeded $800 billion, a chunk of which is paid for by taxpayers. A report from the Institute for Policy Studies found that major corporations like Amazon paid zero federal income taxes in multiple years, despite making billions in profit. They often take advantage of tax credits and deductions that were never meant for giant companies. These include things like R&D tax breaks, which are intended to help small businesses, not multi-billion-dollar giants. Your tax dollars don't just go to things you can see. They fund political agendas and projects that benefit the wealthy and well-connected. Take the example of bailouts. In the 2008 financial crisis, politicians were quick to approve bailouts for banks, many of which had donated to their campaigns. Nearly $700 billion of taxpayer money went to these financial institutions, while the average American faced layoffs and foreclosures. Meanwhile, much-needed programs for healthcare and education get sidelined or slashed. In 2021, nearly 25% of the US federal budget went toward military spending, while only 7% went to education. Politicians, often backed by defense contractors, know that military spending is a great way to keep funds flowing into their pockets and their allies. Chapter 3: The tax games they play. How politicians dodge taxes. If you think that politicians pay taxes like everyone else, think again. Many use creative strategies to lower their tax burdens. One of the most famous tricks is creating grant or retained annuity trusts, GRATs, which allow politicians and the wealthy to transfer assets to heirs without incurring large gift taxes. Consider former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. He used a tax loophole to defer taxes on his speaking fees by funneling the payments through a corporation he owned. This allowed him to avoid taxes on what could have been millions of dollars in income. Another common strategy is creating tax-exempt organizations. Many wealthy politicians and donors set up charities to benefit from tax deductions. But often, these charities serve little purpose other than to reduce taxes. For example, in 2014, a non-profit linked to the Koch brothers raised $500 million, largely through tax-deductible donations, yet its activities were primarily political. There's also the use of income splitting. Politicians and the ultra-wealthy often shift income to family members in lower tax brackets. By splitting their earnings, they avoid paying taxes at the highest rates, a strategy that could lower their overall tax liability by thousands, if not millions, of dollars. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more shocking truths about taxes and politics. Chapter 4: The Tax Divide. Why the poor pay more than the rich. Politicians often claim that they're fighting for the middle class, but in reality, the tax system often hits the poor the hardest. While the wealthiest can afford tax advisors and loopholes, the average person doesn't have that luxury. In 2019, the bottom 50% of earners in the US paid an effective federal income tax rate of around 13%. That's more than 10 times higher than the rate the top 1% paid. The tax code is designed to favor those who can leverage deductions. For instance, if you own a home, you can write off mortgage interest. But what about renters? They get nothing. This means that home ownership, which is out of reach for many lower-income families, becomes an even greater advantage for the rich. Sales taxes and payroll taxes also take a bigger percentage from the poor. Sales taxes are regressive, meaning that those with lower incomes end up paying a larger proportion of their income in taxes when buying goods. In 2020, Americans with incomes under $20,000 paid an average of 8% of their income in sales taxes, while the wealthiest paid only 2%. Even when politicians talk about raising taxes on the rich, they rarely address the hidden taxes the poor face in their everyday lives. For instance, the payroll tax hits workers from the first dollar they earn, but the wealthy stop paying this tax once they hit a certain income threshold. This creates a massive disparity in how taxes are felt by different income groups. Chapter 5: The Truth About Tax Cuts. Is it really for you? Politicians love to promise tax cuts, claiming they'll help you keep more of your hard-earned money. But there's a catch. Most of the tax cuts that sound so good for the middle class end up disproportionately benefiting the rich. In 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, a cut that benefited big businesses and wealthy shareholders more than ordinary Americans. While individual tax cuts were also part of the plan, many of them expire after a few years. Corporate tax cuts, however, are permanent. So while you might enjoy a small tax break for a few years, the corporations are getting a long-term boost. Many of these tax cuts are also funded by increasing the national debt. In fact, the 2017 tax cuts are expected to add over $1.9 trillion to the federal deficit over the next decade. This means future generations will be stuck with the bill. And let's not forget about the trickle-down theory, which has been the backbone of many tax cuts for the rich. The idea is that giving the wealthy more money will eventually benefit everyone as they invest in businesses and create jobs. However, studies show that the wealthiest Americans tend to hoard their money rather than investing it back into the economy, leaving little benefit for the rest of us. Chapter 6: The Hidden Consequences of Rising Taxes. Who really pays the price? Rising taxes don't always mean more funding for essential services. In many cases, higher taxes lead to higher prices and unintended consequences. Politicians rarely mention that when taxes rise on businesses, they often pass those costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices. For example, when the US raised the corporate tax rate in 2017, some companies responded by increasing prices on everyday products. Politicians claim that the rich will pay most of the new taxes, but the reality is that regular people end up shouldering the burden through higher costs of living. Also, higher taxes often mean cuts to social services. Politicians might raise taxes to fund new programs, but they rarely explain how those programs will affect the economy. In some cases, higher taxes on businesses lead to job losses, and the very workers the taxes were intended to help find themselves out of work. In the long term, rising taxes can also stifle economic growth. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that countries with high tax rates tend to have slower economic growth than those with lower rates. This is why some politicians advocate for lower taxes as a way to spur investment and create jobs. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more deep dives into how taxes and politics really work behind the scenes.